I began studying the other two major works of the era, the New Testament and Wars of the Jews by Josephus, a Roman court historian who described the war between the Romans and the Jews in the first century. While reading these works side by side, I noticed an amazing connection between them. Certain events from the ministry of Jesus seemed to closely parallel episodes from the military campaign of Roman Caesar Titus Flavius, a campaign which took place 40 years after Jesus supposedly lived. My efforts to understand these connections led me to an incredible discovery. Christianity had been invented by a little-known family of Roman Caesars, the Flavians, and they left us documents to prove it.
The Flavians are not a household name, and yet it's the Flavians who completely reshaped the Roman Empire. In Rome, of course, there's the Colosseum, which is understood to be the best-known monument of the ancient Roman Empire, perhaps. The Colosseum is, in fact, a Flavian construction produced during the Flavian period. It's under the Flavians that both Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity take shape.
Why would the Flavians be interested in creating religions? Much like today, their era was marked by political power struggles, a bankrupt economy, religious conflicts, and endless wars. In the midst of this turmoil, the Flavians seized control of the Roman Empire and ushered in an immense paradigm shift. To understand the Flavians' rise to power, we need to go back to the reign of the previous powerful rulers, the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Beginning with Julius Caesar in the year 49 BCE, the Julio-Claudians ruled Rome for over 100 years, transforming the government from a republic into an empire. This family contained all the famous Caesars: Julius, who predated the time of Jesus; Augustus, who was Caesar at the time of Jesus' supposed birth; Tiberius, who ruled during Jesus' supposed death, followed by the infamous Caligula; then Claudius, and ending the Julio-Claudian dynasty with Nero, whose reign begins in 54 CE.
The Julio-Claudians enjoyed a godlike status until the family degenerated and began to damage the Roman Empire.
By the time of Nero, his famous decadence was bankrupting the empire, and the Jews of Judea were staging a huge rebellion against their Roman rulers.
Judea was one of the many conquered provinces that made up the Roman Empire. This region, which was also known as Palestine, was controlled by a family that served as Rome's tax collector, the Herods.
They were a Greco-Arab family, somewhat possibly Judaized, though only Judaized when it was convenient to please the subjects they were given, who were put in power in Palestine and destroyed the previous Jewish ruling family, the Maccabean family, root and stalk.
Besides being heavily taxed and ruled by a non-Jewish family put in power by Rome, the Jews were further inflamed by the requirement that a statue of the Caesar be placed for worship in every temple throughout the empire.
In the Roman Empire, you could pretty much have any god you want, but legally you had to submit to the emperor as a god as well. You had to at least acknowledge that the Roman leader was also a divine figure. But the Jews would not have any of it.
It's fundamental to Jewish belief that you shall make no graven images. It's one of the commandments given at Sinai by God. So the Jews never made representations of God.
The Jews had a very different type of religion. They had a religion which was much more focused on the book and less focused upon cultic statues. This presented a real problem for the Romans. They tried to install statues of Caesar, but the Jews weren't going to buy that at all. In fact, it aggravated them, it enraged them, and the Romans really, I think, didn't understand this. It's not statues, it's books.
And those books contained what are known as the Jewish Messianic prophecies.
The thing that most moved the Jews to revolt against Rome was an obscure prophecy from among their writings that a world ruler would come out of Palestine.
Holy books inspired the Jews to expect a redeemer who would redeem Israel, rescue Israel, restore Israel to power and leadership in the world.
The Messiah that the literature described was a warrior. The Messiahs would have claimed the same attributes that David did. David could overcome any army because God gave him the power to do it. If you had the power of God, you could easily defeat the Roman army. The people rebelled against Rome and were led by a Messianic movement that had a series of messiahs that had come forward to fight against the Roman Empire.
The Hebrew word Messiah is translated into Greek as Christos, or Christ, so the title of Christ can describe any of the numerous messiahs of this movement.
Yes, the word Christ or Christians can refer to the Palestine Messianic movement, but it's a later term. It's a later reformulation of the Messianic movement in Palestine.
This movement rebels against Rome in 66 and is successful. It actually defeats them militarily, so it must have been a huge movement. The victorious Jews set up a nation state directly in the Roman Empire.
And the Romans had to do something about it. There was a real danger that this Messianic movement could not only boil over in Judea itself, but could spread to other Jewish communities in other parts of the Roman Empire.
Rome ruled its colonies with a rod of iron, and any resistance was going to be met with brute force.
At this time during Nero's reign, two of the finest military men in the empire were the Flavians, Vespasian and his son Titus.
Vespasian and Titus were military men. They spent a great deal of their life outside of Rome. For over a decade, they had waged war against the Druids in Brittany and Gaul. Vespasian and Titus were successful in essentially destroying the Druids. They left behind no historical record of their existence.
And it's the Flavians that Nero calls upon when he needs to suppress the Jews' rebellion in Judea.
Nero responded by asking his best general, Vespasian, and his son Titus to go into Judea with a huge army, 60,000, 70,000 troops, and a similar number of support individuals. So they meant business. The Romans came down to crush the rebellion.
In the year 66 CE, the Flavians begin their military campaign against the Jews. They start further north in Galilee, where the first of three key events takes place. They destroy the Jewish towns of Galilee. They also capture a Jewish rebel who later becomes a critical figure in the formulation of Christianity.
This is where they captured one of the leaders of the rebellion, a Jew named Josephus bar Matthias. Now, Josephus presented himself to the Flavians as a prophet.
He survived. He survived apparently by telling Vespasian that the prophecies of the Jews pointed out that Vespasian would become emperor. And of course he did, so Vespasian quite liked Josephus. He used him as a translator in his entourage. He used him to appeal to the rebels to surrender.
At this point, Josephus became a turncoat and worked with the Flavians against the rebellion.
Meanwhile, chaos is increasing back in Rome, where Nero's rule is being threatened.
In the year 68, the Senate found the courage to depose Nero, and he committed suicide. Now, in that circumstance, Vespasian was a prime candidate to become emperor.
In the middle of this war, Vespasian returned to Rome and seized the throne. The Flavians then became the imperial family.
With Vespasian becoming the new Caesar in Rome, Titus stays behind on the battlefield and sets his sights on Jerusalem, where the other two key events take place. Titus encircles Jerusalem with a wall, and finally he razes the temple, leaving not one stone atop another.
It took a while. They eventually had to bring on starvation by building a wall, a barricade entirely enveloping the city.
What happens, of course, is the temple in 70 is completely destroyed.
For the Jews, it was the ultimate calamity because, of course, this was the house of their God, and it was destroyed by the Romans quite thoroughly. Titus, of course, was the victor of this great siege. Titus carried the spoils of this captured city back to Rome for his triumph. He took the treasures of the temple, their famous 7-branch candlestick. You can see it on the Arch of Titus in Rome. It celebrates that tremendous victory of Rome again triumphant, and Titus, of course, is the hero of the day.
All of the artifacts from the temple that they seized, they put on public display in what they refer to as the Palace of Peace, except for one item. The Jewish scripture, Josephus records that the Flavians took and placed in their private palace where no one was allowed to see it.
Although Titus Flavius successfully ended the rebellion in Judea, another rebellion soon broke out in Alexandria, Egypt. The Flavians were clear that this was not the end of the Jewish Messianic movement. They also recognized that it was the Jews' Messianic literature that was fueling this movement. So once they captured the Jewish scripture, they had all other copies of it destroyed.
And that's why the Dead Sea Scrolls had to have been buried in a cave, because that was the only way they could be safe from the Roman destruction. There was not a single scrap of literature found from the Messianic movement until the scrolls were discovered. That's why they're such a treasure, because they're the only real voice of the Messianic movement that we have.
And the real voice of the Jews' Messianic movement, according to our scholars, was violent and militaristic, not the pacifistic version depicted in the Gospels.
War against Rome was a Messianic war. So that's why I say that the scrolls are not only the literature of the Messianic movement in Palestine, they're also the literature of the war against Rome.
The Romans needed to subdue the Jews' religion, so they set about influencing it and changing it.
They realise they can't destroy the Jewish religion altogether. That's not their objective. They realise they're sensible enough to realise that they can't do that. So what you have to do is try to create a type of Judaism that is benign. And it's exactly coinciding with the rise of the Flavian dynasty is the arrival of two benign forms of Jewish ideology.
It's during this period that a new literature enters history, which describes a peace-loving, turn-the-other-cheek preaching Jewish Messiah named Jesus Christ. But if the Flavians wrote the Gospels, how could a Roman family know how to write Jewish literature that refers to Jewish prophecy? The answer lies in the Flavians' collaborations with a number of Jewish intellectuals, beginning with their own court historian, Josephus.
Josephus arrives back in Rome with Titus. He becomes an adopted member of the Flavian family. An amazing turn of events for the Jewish turncoat. He becomes Flavius Josephus. Josephus at this time begins writing the history of the war, and he records that Titus gave him the Jewish scripture. Josephus's histories have always been associated with the origins of Christianity.
Time and again you can find parallels between what Josephus writes and what turns up in the Gospels. It's a powerful evidence of their true origin.
In reading the works of Josephus side by side with the Gospels, scholars have noticed parallels between the two works. It appears as though the history of Josephus records events that fulfill the prophecies of the Old and New Testaments. Early Christians understood this connection. In fact, when the Bible first began to be printed in the Middle Ages, it included the history of Josephus.
He was employed to write the official history that we have. The other histories from this period have been destroyed ruthlessly by the Romans. Josephus tells us this in very chilling passages, how the Romans exerted complete control of the literature of this period. There were alternative histories of the Jewish war written. Well, the Romans rounded up the writers of those histories and executed them. They rounded up all the copies of those histories and destroyed them. That is to say, they ruthlessly wiped out any alternative history, so that the only history we have is written by Josephus. And let's remember who Josephus was.
Chief propagandist of the Flavian dynasty, and he was very, very successful. He moved back to Rome. He was given an apartment in the emperor's own townhouse, and he was appointed the chronicler of the Roman-Jewish War, using Vespasian's own diaries of the events.
Also in the pages of his history, Josephus declares that the Jews' Messiah or Christ is none other than Flavius Vespasian and his dynastic family.
To put it succinctly, Josephus says that there was a prophecy that a world ruler would come out of Palestine. The Jews thought this applied to one of their own. They were wrong in their interpretations. He used the most cynical interpretation. He applied it to the rise of the Roman emperor in Palestine.
Josephus recorded that the Messianic prophecies foresaw not a Jew, but Vespasian and his dynasty. In fact, all of the Flavian historians recorded that the Flavian Caesar was the Christ.
It was important to the Flavians that they be seen as the Christ, as divine and godlike, and this was not mere vanity. The Julio-Claudians before them had already established that presenting themselves as gods was a powerful tool in controlling their subjects. When the Flavians took over the throne, they inherited an enormous bureaucracy that was already in place, the Imperial cult, which was dedicated to promoting the idea of Caesar as a god.